fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, Mr. Dave Martino.
Yes.
We're here.
We're here.
It's been a while. I had we had my dog that passed, so we had to take a week off and take care of business and kind of back in the saddle again. Everything's back into it. And of course, you were still touring around online, half naked now. I mean, I don't know what's going on with you.
Those are my Rocky shorts.
Well, the shorts, my God.
The like Apollo shorts. Yeah.
Swimsuit model there. It's like, holy cow. Dad bod in shorts.
Yes. That's right.
You somehow, you didn't look like Rocky.
No.
Just saying, okay? If I would see that picture and I would say, well, that's not Rocky.
Yeah.
So, I'm saying.
With apologies to Sylvester Stallone.
Yeah, poor guy. You'd be Expendables. Yeah, Expendables. Call you Expendables. Yeah, extend it. Let's see what happened. Donald Sutherland died.
Oh yes, that's right.
Another Canadian. You a fan of his?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
Another
Way
Canadian.
Back from,
see?
Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I don't know. Well, so we've got a writer with us. Oh, I know he's sitting on the side, so let's get him in, get him talking. And his Assassins Anonymous book is out. Rob Hart, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, fellas. I appreciate it.
Rob, so what, Sutherland fan or not?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was amazing.
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good actor. I was like, he was able to really pull off some roles. I think that's the big thing, right? If you can make people believe and get into it. That must be something you focus on when you write a book like you've done, like with the Assassins Anonymous. Your characters, you have to make them come alive. What's your method for doing that?
That is a process that is really just hoping and praying. Because whenever I'm writing a first draft, I always feel like it's absolute garbage and it's not coming together. And then I think it's on the subsequent drafts that I can kind of zone in and do that detail work. And I think it's just really important to kind of give your not even your main characters, but your secondary characters enough of a unique identity that it feels like they can sort of like wander off the page and be the star of their own story.
See, with me, my last draft I think is garbage. So you're 10 steps ahead. I
mean, I didn't say any of the other drafts were that much better. I just they improved slightly over time. Even
when you think you write something and it's like, okay, this is great, then you go back to it later and you read, you go, I don't know if I like it. You know what I mean? There's always that. What's your stopping point? How do you go, okay, that's it, this is the way it's going, and that's how you're going to send it in?
In a technical sense, I usually do like 4 or 5 edits of a draft before I send it in. And I always make sure to do one draft backwards, where I start at the end of the book and work my way toward the beginning, because I find that helps put fresh energy in the ending and it helps me to see things out of order. But, from a more obtuse perspective, it's usually when I get to a point that I know there are issues, but I can't really put my finger on them anymore. And that's the point where it's like, okay, my agent needs to look at this. My editor needs to look at this. I need to have some friends read it, because at this point, it's just diminishing returns.
Well, in the same vein, it sounds like your characters also surprise you. You kind of let them go and kind of live their life. How do you keep your characters on track to keep the plot, kind of going where you want it to go? Or do you just let them take it and try to follow them?
I tend to outline very vigorously. I spend a ton of time outlining. And so usually I've got a pretty strong roadmap when I get started, but I do allow for some discovery within the process itself. I just kind of have a rule for myself that the second I get bored, the reader's going to get bored. So I just try to do my best to keep from getting bored at any possible time.
Well, let's talk about the premise of the story. So what is the basic premise of Assassins Anonymous?
In the absolute shortest kernel, it's John Wick gets into a recovery program for killers, essentially. But I've been wanting to write an assassin novel for the longest time. I love the genre because the assassin kind of fits in with like the samurai and the gunslinger and the private eye and all these sort of archetypal characters. And it's this guy, Mark, who at one time was the world's deadliest assassin, who he hits kind of like a personal rock bottom, and he finds this recovery program of retired killers who just don't want to kill people anymore. And then, of course, someone shows up trying to kill him, and he suddenly has to figure out what's going on and finds that this world is a lot more difficult to navigate when you can't kill anyone anymore.
So, Mark, how is that character developed, created? Where did he come from?
That was kind of funny because this is one of the first times in a long time I sat down and just started writing a book. I mean, I had done some structural stuff in the beginning, but my last two books, The Warehouse and The Paradox Hotel, they were big speculative fiction books, and they took a lot of time and a lot of research. I mean, the last book was time travel, and time travel always sounds like it's fun. It's like going to White Castle. It sounds great until you actually do it. And then it just turns into a complete nightmare. But for this one, I just kind of sat down and started writing. And the only thing that I knew going in was that I wanted Mark to be really charming and really funny, because I knew that halfway through the book, he was going to do some pretty terrible things. And if I didn't make the reader love him, then the reader could just very easily turn their back on him.
Character is probably the most important thing, right?
Oh, yeah.
So did you start with him first, or were you just writing it and you created him out of it?
His voice came pretty easily to me. Like, I knew I wanted it to be someone who was just the absolute top of their game, who everyone was terrified of. And it's funny because in previous books, voices haven't clicked for me this quickly, and his was just kind of there to the point where I wrote the first chapter and I didn't have much more than that. And I went to a reading at my friend's bar in North Carolina, and I read the first chapter, and people went nuts. They loved it. And that was kind of the encouragement I needed to actually sit down and finish it, because I had people come up to me and say, wow, like, when's that coming out? I'm like, I have no idea. I haven't written it yet. So it was an interesting experiment in just sort of sitting down and having fun and letting go of certain parts of my process and just seeing what happens.
Wonder if you were an assassin in your previous life.
I am not that cool and not that tough. But you know, I did want to kind of play around with this idea of someone who's in a place where they've made mistakes and they recognize that they've made mistakes and they want to be a better person, but they're not sure if change is possible. Because that's where I'm at. Like, I'm 41 years old. You know, I'm at a point where I'm looking back at the things that I've done in my life, and there are things I'm proud of and things I'm less proud of, and I want to be a better person. And you know, I'm trying to figure out what that takes, and I'm trying to be more mindful about that. And I mean, every book for me is kind of like therapy, but it's great because instead of me paying a therapist, I'm getting paid. And so the question here was, is change possible? And then it's like, okay, let's explore this through the lens of an assassin, because, you know, obviously that's the simplest path.
So did you go out and kill people and experiment?
I can't answer that. Come on.
We won't tell anyone.
Yeah.
I did revisit a lot of my favorite assassin movies, like John Wick. You know, that franchise is great, but also, you know, some of the older stuff like Day of the Jackal was a really good one. Nobody with Bob Odenkirk is a fun one. There was this great little movie called Interview with a Hitman that was this little indie film that came out years ago that was really interesting. And Les Samurai, the French film, that's a really good one. You know, it's a fun genre to play around in.
Is this a really action-filled book? Is there killings and stuff like that going on in the book?
Oh, absolutely, because I decided to have my cake and eat it too. Because the book basically takes place on two timelines. There's the main timeline where, you know, he's on the run and trying to figure out what's going on. But then there's a past timeline. It's flashback sequences to, you know, how he got recruited, how he got into this lifestyle, and the things that made him as good as he is. And so you do get to kind of see him as his prime. And I was pulling a little bit on some of my background. Like I do fight training. I did Krav Maga for years, and then I'm doing Muay Thai now. And so I always try to be really mindful of how an action sequence is structured, in terms of like the geography and the pacing and what the human body is capable of. And obviously it's in a bit of a fantastical space. It's not like, you know, there's not a real covert agency of assassins anywhere. At least I hope not. The action stuff is always my favorite part. I love breaking down those scenes and blocking them out, trying to figure out how can I do something here that's going to be really fun and really interesting and unlike what people have read before.
I do Mai Tais too.
Oh, nice. Okay. Oh, yeah, I'll bet. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do Mai Tais as well. That's more of an evening thing.
Do you find it difficult to try and make sure that the details are accurate when you're doing fight fights, because you were talking about fight scenes, but also when you use weapons or, assassins have different tools of the trade, so to speak, to make sure it's real accurate with the real world?
There are ways in which I do want to be accurate. I mean, I do believe that in a lot of circumstances, you never really have to be 100% accurate. You just have to be believable. But there are things that I try to stay away from, like, and just as a really, hyper focused example, I just finished writing the sequel to this. And there's an instance where someone is using defibrillators, or it's suggested that someone used defibrillators on someone who's died. And it's like, well, a defibrillator doesn't actually bring a person back to life. It just restores a normal heart rhythm in someone who's having an abnormal heart rhythm. So it's stuff like that I tend to get a little wonky about, like, because movies tell us these things that aren't necessarily true. I will say that Steve Concoli, who is a military guy, he read this book and he was impressed. He's like, you only screwed up one thing, and that's kind of impressive. And I was pretty happy to hear that. Apparently I messed up a detail about night vision goggles, but everything else I got right. So I'm like, all right, cool. I got his sign off. I'm good.
Are you thinking about the reader then when you're writing a story? Like when you're sitting down and you're kind of blowing out the draft and that, and when you're going through, are you thinking about, what are they going to think about this, or do you do that sort of thing?
Absolutely. I tend to sometimes think of myself as an entertainer more than a writer. Like I'm trying to do something that's going to be entertaining for the person who's taking the time to pick up the book. And honestly, the person I always have in my mind is my mom. My mom is, first off, she's my biggest fan. And she is currently, I have to go to her house later because she has like 10 more books for me to sign for her friends, because she goes out and she buys them. And I have to remind her, I'm like, you are getting paid back for these, right? She's like, sure. I always kind of feel like if I'm writing for my mom, I'm doing okay. And that was specifically more important when I was doing like the time travel book, right? Because my mom works in a bowling alley. She's not an astrophysicist. So if I can write time travel in a way that she can understand it and enjoy it, then I'm going to be good. So in a book like this, sometimes it kind of pops in my head like, oh, what is my mom going to think about this? And it's kind of fun to have that as sort of like a guiding light.
Right. So there's no sex scenes then?
There's a little bit, not a lot. Yeah, I always, those are the moments when I always get like, okay, this is where it's going to get weird, but my mom's not going to say anything to me directly, so it's going to be fine.
Are you conscious of the violence too? Are you sensitive to how you portray characters now?
I would say, in a larger sense, I want the violence to be realistic, in the sense that I want it to carry the appropriate amount of weight. But one of the other reasons that I wrote the book is that, you watch a movie like John Wick, right? And he's running around and he's just shooting people in the head. And every single person he's shooting in the head, like we celebrate and we cheer because they were a quote unquote bad guy. But the thing is that person probably had a family or someone who loved them, and their life is worse now because that person is dead. So I wanted to kind of play in that gray area of like, well, what does this mean really when you take away that sort of excitement factor? And what is the weight of this violence and this death mean to other people? That's always, I never want to treat it as just like look, and I love the John Wick movies. I'm not condemning them at all. Like I'm a humongous fan, but I don't want to turn it into like a glorification thing of, oh, look how cool this was. It was like, hey, this was brutal, because this kind of thing is a very brutal thing.
It's almost video game-like.
Yeah.
And so there's no feeling toward all the bodies that are piling up.
Yeah, and those could be fun in sort of like an escapist way. But when it comes down to like what I want to do, like I wanted to just play in that space of like, okay, there's a lot of moral gray here. So I just want to kind of wallow in that for a little while.
So have you killed off people that you know in your real life in the book? Like, some real nasty person. And we want names and some phone numbers. We can get them on the line here.
Honestly, and I've heard other writers joke about that. I've never really done that. But I don't, I kind of draw traits from people sometimes, like people I know, friends, but I never really write characters who are fully and completely based on another person, in the sense that they're like an avatar that I want to sort of like toy with or torture or do something to. Yeah, for me, every character is sort of like an amalgam of all these different traits and characteristics.
So how long does it take you to do something like this? Like this book here, what was it from start to finish for you?
This was the fastest book I ever wrote. This was 5 months. And part of that was because my agent was like, hey, I would like to sell this before the London Book Fair and then be able to go to the London Book Fair with it. So can you get it done by such and such a date? And I looked at how many words I had, and I looked at, I think it was like I had maybe a month and a half at that point. And I was like, this seems impossible, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I just buckled down and got it done. But I'm privileged in two senses. One is that I'm a full-time writer. So sitting down and doing the work is it's easy to find the time. And the other is I have a degree in journalism, and I worked as a journalist for years. So that's something that's very helpful for me because I'm just good at meeting deadlines and working quickly.
Do you have a meaning? Is there a subtext that you hope people take away from the book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Like, I want people to just kind of, maybe think a little bit more about the way we process violence as entertainment, but also realize that everyone is sort of waging their own battle that we know nothing about, and to be a little bit more empathetic and a little bit more thoughtful. Because, yeah, everyone makes mistakes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that someone should be damned for all of eternity. And like there's a lot of gray area in that. Like there are some mistakes that are horrible and some that are unforgivable. But, I think when someone is trying to be better, we ought to give them the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah. And look, like people should be held account for their actions, but they're also, if someone is truly willing to make amends, like there has to be a pathway to redemption.
How do you get into the psychological part of this? Like, and especially because you're saying how they're in a meeting, so that you've got assassins sitting around, group therapy type thing. Do you really get into therapy, or is it just sort of a setting?
Oh no, they absolutely are. It's a bunch of hitmen sitting around talking about their feelings, which was part of the appeal of writing this to me, because I just thought that would be a really funny scene. But it was interesting when I started doing research on this and was thinking in terms of recovery. I found that there's been studies that show similarities in brain structure between people who are addicts and people who kill, in terms of things like impulse control. And we know that it doesn't have to be a substance to be addictive. Like people can be addicted to gambling, because it's about the risk, it's about the reward, it's about, getting some kind of prize at the end, it's about people admiring your abilities. So it was kind of fun to dig down into this idea of this guy is so good at killing people that he's now addicted to it. It's the only way that he knows how to interact, because he's never been taught to have hard conversations or to think about his actions. It was always like, your job is to do this. And he was so good at it. He's like, well, of course, this is what I'm supposed to do.
Well, how do you balance with something like that? It's kind of a darker aspect. How do you balance the humor and the satire of the novel with the more serious aspects of the book?
That's one of those things that I feel like comes in the editorial process, because the tone can kind of shift a little all over the map. And then as I'm going through it again, it's just trying to be mindful of where that tone is and making sure that it's correct. But at the same time, I mean, humor fits really well into dark spaces, because humor is a pressure release valve a lot of the time, or the things that people joke around about will tell you a lot about them. So I found that seeing it as what it is as kind of like a release valve, or something to lighten the mood, or someone basically trying to like avoid a tough feeling by making a joke, thinking about the way people deploy it in real life made it a little bit easier.
Yeah, and it's got to be the right timing too, right? With the humor.
Oh yeah,
it can be in the wrong place. I know all about that. It happens to me daily.
Yeah. I think I think the thing that worked in my favor is that I'm just generally a wise ass. So it's an easy place to write from.
What do you get out of a book when you write it? How do you think it changes you or affects you?
I mean, each book has a little catharsis for me. Again, it's going back to this idea of me asking these questions of myself and getting to a place where I might not necessarily have a really clear and direct answer, but I at least have a little bit of a better understand question that I'm trying to ask. And so, and this, I would even say this goes back to one of the earlier questions of like, when do you know you're done? It's like, I feel like I know I'm done and ready to move on from it when I've gotten to that point of, okay, like I feel all right now.
So now you've already done a sequel, so you plan on kind of staying in this category for a while.
That's the hope. It was optioned for a film by Amblin and Spielberg, which was pretty amazing. And the sequel is filed, and but that's the end of my contract with Putnam. So I think we're going to be having conversations soon of whether they would like me to do more books, which I would love. And so far the book seems to be doing well, so I'm hopeful. And yeah, it's a fun space because I feel like I can write like 10 of these because the second book actually centers another character from the group. So it's really easy to, when you have a room full of assassins, it's like you can kind of turn the camera a little bit and say, okay, what's this person's story? Like, this will be interesting.
No, that's great. Oh, and you worked with James Patterson, eh?
I did. Yeah, it was kind of a one-off thing. Like they had this idea years ago to do book shots, which were novella-length books. And so there were only like 30,000 words and they were going to be digital in print. And they thought this was a brilliant idea. And it was a pretty cool idea. It was a fun project to work on. But I guess it was just sort of saturating the market. Like booksellers were like, we can't turn over, 5 new releases a month. And readers were like, we're not reading this much. So they ultimately canceled the program, but I got to do one before it ended. And I thought it was a ton of fun. And some of the notes he gave me, I mean, they just went right in my toolbox. They were fantastic, fantastic notes.
Yeah, he's a good guy. I used to do his laundry.
That probably pays better than what I'm making.
Well,
You had mentioned, you're going to do a sequel, or you're working on a sequel as we speak. How do you handle continuity? Do you have tools, systems? How do you go about that?
With a wing and a prayer. I mean, I didn't really have the sequel in mind when I was writing the first one, but there were things in the first one that I was able to pick up and reframe in the second one, which was super fun. And there was a moment that I was pretty happy about that I got to go in and sneak a line into the first one that kind of pays off in the second one. But yeah, it's sort of, I feel like I'm building myself a puzzle that I have to solve, because then I look at the first book and I'm like, okay, how do I continue to make everything make sense? I'm starting to think of ideas for the third book, which I haven't really solidified yet. But, now I have to kind of look at the first two and say to myself, okay, how do I make this make sense? But part of the challenge of writing a series is that you've got to pitch like straight down the middle between, wanting to satisfy people who have read more than one entry, but also make it readable to someone who hasn't read any of the other books. So you're trying to satisfy both sides, and it's kind of difficult. Though I think, at least in terms of continuity, it makes it a little bit easier because you don't have to worry so much about the details of the previous book. Like, you want to reward the people who stuck with it, but it doesn't have to be such a direct continuation that you're just going to end up sitting there, trying to figure out like timelines and stuff.
What kind of relationship do you have with your characters, like your main characters? How do you describe that?
I would say, I don't know, because I don't want to say they're like kids, because I have a kid and I wouldn't put her through anything that I put my characters through. Maybe like nieces and nephews, feel a little less attached. Yeah, no, I don't know. It's weird because I mean, I care about them all very deeply. I want them all to do well, or at least, do what it is that they're supposed to do. Sort of like playing with like really cool action figures. Like, you don't want to break them too much. You want to enjoy them, but you want them to still be there when you're done.
So what happens when the book's over? Like, what happens to your characters then? Do they stay with you?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. That's part of the fun process right now of thinking in terms of a third book. Because I'm just looking at this meeting of assassins and I'm like, all right, whose story do I want to focus on this time? And who's going to be the most interesting one to dig into? And how do I make their story different? Like, I know how their stories are different, but then when you're actually digging into like the past stuff, it's like, how is their motivation different? How is their pathway different? And that's just a really fun space to be in. So
you hear them actually. Or do you see them like a movie?
I would say I hear them more than I see them. I don't really picture actors in terms of who they are in the book, which is always kind of interesting to me, because once I finish a book and so it got optioned, and I was like, okay, cool. If they were going to cast it, this would be really interesting. And then I heard like a week ago, they're meeting with an actor, who I never would have thought of, but is also an excellent choice. So I'm just like, cool, like, you paid me, do what you want.
I mean, plus if you're thinking about it when you're writing it, a character, I think that it'll direct how you write that character.
Yeah, to a degree. Though I will say I've got a book coming out in October called Dark Space, and I co-wrote it with Alex Segura. And it's a sci-fi novel. It's basically if John Le Carré was writing Star Trek, and it's a big cast of characters. And one of the things Alex does we created this Google Doc that was basically our planning document with all our notes and outlining and stuff. And for each character, he would pull a photo of an actor. And I found that was kind of helpful not so much in terms of finding their voice, but in just being able to differentiate everyone from each other. It made them feel a little bit more solid. But I've never written a book with that many cast members before, so it was definitely an interesting process.
It's different. Do you like writing with another writer like that? Do you find it easy or hard? Like, how do you do it with the characters then? Like when you're shifting characters and write characters, if you have a different idea.
I've been really lucky in the sense that, me and Alex are really good friends, and he was also a journalist. And one of the things that you learn in journalism is that you could submit a story at the end of your shift at 5 and see it in the paper next day, and it'll be completely different because circumstances change. They have to send out another reporter. The editor might have to rewrite it for space. You just kind of accept that that's the process. And me and Alex don't really have egos in terms of our work with each other. We understand that the best idea has to win. And I'm currently co-writing a book, which we haven't announced yet, and I can't say who it's with, but it's with a TV showrunner who has this really cool idea. And we're putting it together now. And again, like, he's a TV guy. He's used to working collaboratively. So, there's been times where I've come to him and I'm like, hey, I know you wanted to do this, but what if we did this? And he would be like, oh, that's awesome. You should do that instead. So I think I've been really lucky in the sense that I've worked with people who just kind of get it. They just want to tell a good story, and they're not worried about how big of a thumbprint they have on it.
Let's talk about how people get a hold of you, or do you like to interact with readers? Do you have social media, a website, OnlyFans? Like, what do you like to do with readers?
I do. I just started my OnlyFans. It has it has one subscriber, and I don't know who it is, but I'm appreciative of them. I have a website, robwhart.com, and then I'm on Instagram at robwhart1. That tends to be like my main sort of contact point on social media at this point. I also do Twitter at robwhart, but that site is turning into a bit of a dumpster fire. And I have a weekly newsletter I put out at robwhart.substack.com. No, I love interacting with people. Like, that's the best part. It's sort of, you do so much of this by yourself in a dark room. And so when you finally put something out and you see people responding to it, it is just the absolute best feeling, because it's like, all right, like, it's something now.
Do you follow the reviews, or do you stay away from that?
Oh, no, I do. You're not supposed to, and I think a lot of people say they don't, and they probably do. But I do like to check my Goodreads pages and my Amazon reviews every now and again. And the reviews on this one have been good. And look, like, at the end of the day, not every book is for everyone. Someone's going to read it and they're not going to like it, and that's going to be okay.
Well, we'll put everything up on our website so that everyone can find you. And, of course, the book is available now, Assassins Anonymous. Rob Hart, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.